Dr. Cooper. So hello, everyone. Welcome to today's critical conversation with Dr. Michelle Asher Cooper from the U.S. Department of Education. The purpose of this session is to engage with Michelle and with all of you on why representation matters, where and when decisions are being made. Why is it so important to be sure that policymakers represent a wider variety of lived experiences, and how might a more diverse cohort of policymakers change the way we think through solutions to today's problems? Now, just to frame how we're going to proceed, I'm going to start with a short introduction of Michelle, and then I'm going to have each of you introduce yourselves. I'll call you out 3 at a time and just share your name and your organization. Then I'm going to start with a few introductory questions, and then we'll move it to open Q&A. Just like your content sessions, you can either raise your hand virtually or you can ask questions in Slido. Austin is going to put the link to Slido in the chat. For those of you who couldn't make the morning, Slido allows all of you to either type in a question of your own or upvote someone else's questions for me to get to. And then, of course, I want to remind all of you that today's session is recorded. So with that, I'm going to start my introduction with one of my most favorite colleagues, Dr. Michelle Asher Cooper. So Michelle currently serves as the Acting Assistant Secretary for Post-Secondary Education and Deputy Assistant Secretary for Higher Education Programs at the U.S. Department of Education. In these roles, she oversees the department's work to strengthen and support the capacity of colleges and universities to promote innovation and improvement for students and broaden the attainment of global competencies that drive the economic success and competitiveness of our nation. That's not a small job. Most importantly, most recently, she served as the president of the Institute for Higher Education Policy, IHEP, where she managed the organization's expansive research portfolio and advocacy agenda. A recognized advocate for racial and economic equity, an experienced practitioner, and a demonstrated leader, Dr. Cooper is a champion of access and success for all students in higher education. So, Michelle, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
And now I'm going to do the introductions of everyone else. So I'm just going to call 3 names at a time and just unmute yourself. I'm also going to ask, if I may, since this is a critical conversation and we really want to think of this as a conversation, to the extent possible, we'd love to see your faces on screen. But let's start. I've got Caitlin, Austin, and Jenna in my view.
Hi, I'm Caitlin DiBenedetto. I'm a research analyst with IHEP.
Caitlin, I do know you. We could have skipped you. Hi, Caitlin.
Hello, my name is Austin. I'm a communications associate for PMPI. I just started last month.
All right.
Hi, nice to see you. I'm Jenna Sablon. I'm a senior policy analyst at SHIEL.
And then I see Danielle, Nathan, and Molly.
Hello, my name is Danielle Bostic. I'm actually a fellow alum at University of Georgia. So I work here as an academic advisor, but I finished up my doctorate and PhD in education, focus on college student affairs, and I'm really interested in transitioning into a career working with policy or having some impact on that in higher education, as well as, administrative route too. So that's why I'm here today.
Thanks, Danielle.
Hi, I'm Nathan Arnold, Senior Advisor with Education Council. Good to see you, Michelle.
Yeah, Nathan. Hi, Nathan. How you doing?
Hi, I'm Molly Hall Martin. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Iowa and an IHEP alum.
Good to see you, Molly.
And now I see Caitlin, Bradley, Reagan, and Emmanuel.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Vites. I do government relations for the American Association of University Professors.
Nice to meet you, Caitlin.
Hi, Bradley Custer, Senior Policy Analyst for Higher Education at the Center for American Progress.
Hey there, Bradley.
Hi, Reagan Fitzgerald, Manager of the Project on Student Borrower Success at the Pew Charitable Trusts.
Nice to meet you, Reagan.
Hello, Michelle. Good to see you. Emmanuel Guillory here with the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities.
Hey there.
And now I see Raymond, Janan, Sarah, and Rachel.
Hello, everyone. Raymond Al-Casey, and I am Policy Manager at the National College Attainment Network.
Oh, Raymond, I haven't seen you in a long time. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Hey everyone, Janan Batar, and I serve as the Director for Higher Ed Research and Data Analytics for the Education Trust. Happy to be with you all.
Hi, Sarah Salomeyer. I'm a Project Director in New America's Higher Education Program.
All right. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, I'm Rachel Gentry, Assistant Director of Federal and State Relations at NASFA, the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, and also an IHEP alum. It's good to see you, Michelle.
Good to see you.
Hi, I'm Rachel Fenton. I was a House staffer for Congressman Ehlers for many years, and now I'm primarily a mom to a 5th grader and a 2nd grader.
Way to do it, Rachel. Nice to meet you.
And then I see Jasmine, Thelma, and Caroline.
Good morning. My name is Jasmine Ham. I am an Academic Affairs Associate, Resource Management at Loyola Marymount University.
Nice to meet you, Jasmine.
Hi, I'm Thelma Ross, Director of Student Financial Aid at Prince George's Community College.
Hello.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi, everyone. Caroline Altman-Smith, the Deputy Director of Education at the Kresge Foundation in Detroit. Thank you so much to Mary Ellen and the PNPI team for organizing this great day. And I'm also unofficially co-chair of the Michelle Cooper fan club. So it's great to be here.
And I'm in your fan club too. Good to see you, Caroline.
And I'm eating lunch. Sorry to be off camera for the moment.
No problem. Hi, Caroline. And then I see Phil, I see Letty, I see Jocelyn.
Hi, Phil Martin at the Education Trust. Good to be here.
Hi, how you doing?
Good to see you.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see you all. Letty Bustillos, Interim Senior Program Officer at the Gates Foundation.
And I count you as an IHEP alum too, Letty. Good to see you.
Thank you. And definitely part of the fan club.
Hello, I'm Jocelyn Cisneros, and I am a fellow at the Kresge Foundation. And it's finally great to meet you after I heard so many great things about you.
Good
And
to meet you.
Thank you. I'll be off camera. I'm eating lunch as well.
And then I've had some shuffling of boxes here, but I think we have left Shelby, Richard, and Lexi.
Hi, I'm Shelby Klebs. I'm an Education Policy Advisor at Third Way.
Hi, Shelby.
Hey, good morning. My name is Richard Davis. I'm an MPA student at Louisiana State University and a State Policy Fellow at the Louisiana Budget Project.
Nice to meet you, Richard.
Hi, I'm Lexi West. I'm a Senior Associate for the Project on Student Borrower Success at the Pew Charitable Trust.
Nice to meet you, Lexi.
Thank you, everyone. So we really wanted to hear your voices given the conversation and what we're talking about today. So thank you for your patience with all that. So the first thing, Michelle, I want to do is I just want to start with the basics. So in the context of the work that we do in federal post-secondary policymaking, what do we mean by representation?
Well, okay, I can answer that, but I just want to start by thanking you, Mary Ellen. Thank you for all that you've been doing for PNPI. I've known Mary Ellen for a really long time, so I knew her when she started PNPI, and I am so grateful and impressed with what she has been able to do with this organization and bringing really talented, wonderful people like you all together. And I want to echo my thanks for you all doing the exercise of introducing yourselves. You know, it's always weird when you, at least for me, when you're on screen and people are on the other side, like I don't always know who's there. But when I saw the list of folks who were coming, I'm like, oh, I know some of them, but I actually don't know all of them. And I actually want to know all of them because I've seen lots of your names in my inbox. I've read some of your reports. So I feel like I know you even if I don't. And now having gone through that exercise, I can actually say, yeah, I kind of do know them. And I'm also hoping that in this conversation, I can hear from you and learn from you because I will not consider myself the definitive expert on representation. I just have some opinions. And I'm open to you all engaging with me about my opinions and, you know, maybe even challenging a few of them. I would love that. So your question was, what do we mean by representation? And so I will start with a textbook answer, and then I'll give you sort of a illustration of this in real life. So the textbook answer is a simple one, is when you are acting in the interests of the people that you represent. And usually this needs to be an individual who is authorized to act on behalf of that group. And so authorization comes in different forms. You know, I work a lot with Congress, and many of you do too. We vote. And that's how we give people authorization. But there are other ways that we can be representatives, and other ways that that authorization can be manifested. And it's really about having some type of intimacy, legitimacy, familiarity with the group that you represent. So whether that is on the higher ed front, that could be students, that could be faculty, that could be veterans. There's a lot of ways that representation. So that's sort of my textbook answer to your question. In terms of seeing this illustrated in real life, I want to tell you about a woman by the name of Michelle Clark. Anybody here, and put it in the chat, anyone here ever heard of Michelle Clark? If you did, yes, no. Okay, I don't see anything coming through. So I'm guessing many of you have never heard her name. So Michelle Clark was the first Black female correspondent for the CBS Evening News back in the 70s. And on December 8th, 1972, she boarded a flight from Washington, D.C. To Chicago. And the flight crashed, killing everyone on board, including Michelle Clark. I was named in her honor. My mother named me Michelle. My father got my middle name, which is Asha. Both these names have stories, but I was named in honor of Michelle Clark. And I was named because she was the first Black woman that my mother had ever seen on TV. And she wanted me, her daughter, to be as influential as Michelle Clark. And she wanted me to be a representation of influence and importance for my family, but also for my community. So that's where my name comes from. I don't know if some of you may have heard that story before, but I was named after Michelle Clark, a woman who my parents never knew, who was living in a city that my parents had never visited. I think my mother was in her 50s when she finally made it to New York. I don't think my father ever got there. And here they were honoring this woman because of her presence, because of what she meant to them by simply showing up and doing the news on in the evenings on CBS. So I say that there's power in representation because you cannot be what you cannot see. And based on the fact that Michelle Clark was this representative figure for my mother, probably other Black mothers, other people in the Black community who was lost at a very young age due to that flight crash, it just meant a lot. And it really helped my mother create her vision for my future for a woman she had only seen on TV. So this is kind of what happens every day, whether we consciously or unconsciously realize it or not. We base our visions of our future, our possibilities, our potential on what we see in our everyday environments. And so it is very important that we have authentic representation in influential spaces, especially in policymaking.
Thanks, Michelle. I had not heard that story before. So thank you for sharing that. You know, you and I have talked before about representation in terms of lived experiences. So why is it important that policymakers and those who influence them as well represent a variety of lived experiences? And related to that, how might we encourage people or create safe spaces at work for people to feel comfortable to share their lived experiences?
Okay. Well, representation across all identities, which would be race and sexuality and ability, socioeconomic status, age. You know, when we have that in the policy-making process, it really does bring, I believe, benefits, very tangible benefits to the health and functioning of our democracy. When we see that in other spaces, I know many of you are in the education space, you know, when we have representation in our schools or in our colleges, it means that it brings some health to our classrooms and, you know, a lot more flavor and color. So representation, I think is really important in politics and in policymaking because it's important for the people who are creating laws, creating procedures that govern our lives and our circumstances, that they look like us And if they don't look like us, they at least understand us or want to understand us. And right now in the US, I believe we are about 50% women and 40% people of color. Yet, if we look at the demographics of Congress, we are barely at the 25% mark when it comes to representation. And I'm actually rounding up here. I actually think it's closer to 23% for both women and people of color in terms of representation in Congress. So there's still a lot of room for growth there, a lot of room for growth, considering the demographics of our society and also the shifting and increasing diversity that we will continue to see in our society. I think this is important for 3 reasons that I'll just sort of rattle off. First, real engagement matters on these issues. Like, we want real engagement on matters of importance to real people. And too often, I truly believe that policymakers and political leaders will appeal to diverse constituents to get their vote. But once they get elected, they forget about the promises that they made. And that then leads to the perpetuation and the amplification of systemic inequities that we actually need to be eradicated. And so when we have people in these positions who really care about the communities, who are familiar with the lived experiences, I think that we do a whole lot more for really eradicating long-term systemic inequities. The second thing I believe is that the messenger is just as important, sometimes more important than the message. And when you have an authentic leader who is a representative of that community, they are more than likely able to influence behavior. I think, the area that I've seen this more most recently has been in the area of vaccinations. I think everybody here understands that, people of color, low-income communities have been the least likely to get vaccinated because of general distrust that they have in the government. However, when they are approached, informed, educated by people who they trust, whether that be family members, community leaders, civil rights leaders, church leaders, sororities, fraternities, they are more likely to listen to the information and use that to inform their judgment versus listening to the CDC. No disrespect to the CDC. I think they do important work. And also, I think it really, when you have representation, the third thing I would say is that it signals to everyone who can and cannot participate. And this probably lends itself to your second part of your question, Mary Ellen, about how do we create safe spaces. I think that in order for people to sometimes feel safe, they've got to know that the person in the leadership role is someone that they can trust. And right now, with low levels of inclusion and in senior leadership role and political leadership role, that leads people to believe that they shouldn't trust the system because the system doesn't represent them, the system doesn't work for them, and all of that leads to an unhealthy democracy. And I believe many of you are already leaders in your organizations, and if you aren't yet a leader in your organization, I'm pretty sure you will be at some point. I think it's really important that we model the types of behaviors we want people to feel. And so I try to make sure I am bringing my truest and most authentic self in the best ways to my colleagues at work, because I want them to feel like they can show up that exact same way in any encounter they have with me or in any organization or external party that they may represent on behalf of me or on behalf of the organization. And I certainly did that a lot with my colleagues at IHEP, but I certainly also try to do that here at the U.S. Department of Education.
And Michelle, could you share, maybe you have some examples specifically related to federal policymaking in higher ed. How does representation influence the way we frame, debate, and craft public policy? Have you seen instances where who was in the room and who they represented, or who, even if they weren't of a particular underserved group, they came in representing them? What difference did that make?
Yeah, I think we've all probably seen examples of that, because given the percentages of women, people of color, other diverse backgrounds that we know are in political leadership, we know that some of our identities, some of our lived experiences are not necessarily reflected in our policymakers, but that doesn't make them a monolith. There are things that I consider sort of the identities that we can see, and then there are things that we can't always see. But I think what we want to know in terms of our leaders is also, we want to know who, but we also want to understand the why and the how, right? So we want them, at least I want them, to be in roles where they are committed to disrupting patterns that have created and perpetuated systemic inequities. I don't want people representing me who are not willing to rock the boat and who are comfortable with the status quo. I think where we've seen evidence of this, some examples is, in most notably in the area of funding. We fund colleges in ways that are inherently inequitable. We give community colleges, institutions that are serving students with great need, students who have been not served well by the elementary, secondary educational system because they have gone to under-resourced institutions, secondary schools, students who have been born into poverty. We give them the least amount of resources in our policymaking, and that's problematic. And I think if we had more people around the table who could give voice to this, who understood this, and who were truly advocates for that community, we would see things done a little bit differently. We're starting to see evidence of that. I'm hopeful even in this administration, we see evidence of that. We have really strong advocates for community colleges. The other area I would say is in HBCUs. That's another really good example around underfunding. Many of you may be familiar with Tennessee State, and the battle is currently raging with the state of Tennessee, where it has realized that, or maybe the state of Tennessee has realized, I'm sure Tennessee State always knew this, that they've had funding withheld for decades. And when they totaled the amount of funding that has been withheld for decades, it came to the tune of $500 million. In the state of Maryland, pretty close to Washington, D.C., where many of us are located, Maryland just settled a lawsuit with 4 HBCUs, and those schools got $477 million because of historic underfunding. But when we have people in place who get these issues, who can represent these communities, we can start to see evidence of a change of tide in terms of how things get done. And so I just think, why people do the work is just as important as who. I also think how people do the work is also really important. And when we are in spaces where we can influence conversations or contribute to them in a meaningful way, I think we need to make sure that we are centralizing those conversations around equity. And when we are talking about equity, we've got to be able and be willing to say who we're really talking about. How are we targeting these interventions for the communities that need them to most, and be willing to call that out. I also think we need to have an inclusive and a collaborative frame versus a winner takes all or a zero-sum game kind mentality. And I think very often in policy making, we have this zero-sum game where somebody's got to win and somebody's got to lose. But I don't think it actually has to be that way. And I also think you have to think about this from a position of assets. Very often I've heard people talk about communities of color, low-income students with this deficit frame, but really it should be coming from a position of strength. And recognizing that when we talk about diversity, when we think about equity, when we think about equality, we're really thinking about the value that many different kinds of people will bring to whatever setting that is, whether that is a state or whether that's a district or whether that's policymaking. There is value in diversity. There's not a problem with diversity.
Thanks, Michelle. So I'm going to ask a question that came in through Slido, and then I'm going to open it up. So if anyone wants to raise their hand, but the question, what came in is, what advice do you have for navigating the challenges of being the only in the room or in your organization? So getting back to the individual, what advice do you have for individuals who are the only in their organization or in the room at the time that we're talking about policy?
My first advice is stay in the room. Don't leave the room. Because if you leave the room, then nobody's in the room. Unfortunately, I am often the only in the room, and often find myself having to advocate for communities that I'm known to be interested in, as well as those that if I don't speak up for them, then absolutely nobody will speak up for them in that room. And so my primary advice is stay in the room, make sure that you are always prepared for the conversations that are happening inside that room, and also the conversations that are probably happening when you leave the room. Make sure you're prepared for that. And also know that it's exhausting. So because it's exhausting, it's important to have friends, allies, other colleagues that can support you as you are the representative and the one that's in the room. But it is a position of privilege to be able to get in the room. So I want to make sure that I strongly encourage you all to stay there, advocate for the communities that we care about, make sure that you are a well-informed, well-equipped, well-educated ambassador for all of them, but don't neglect self-care and the need for refueling your tank, because it is exhausting to be in that position.
Thanks, Michelle. Bradley, I see your hand is raised. I'm going to go to you next.
Thanks, Mary Ellen. And I'm thinking about Mary Ellen's prompt about examples of where representation has come up in policymaking processes. Many of us on this call are watching the negotiated rulemaking process that's happening right now. And that process includes directly impacted people who are representing constituencies, people like current students, current borrowers, formerly incarcerated people. And what many of us are observing, though, and what we're hearing from some of those representatives is that what they say during the policymaking process does not get the same weight as education department lawyers or people representing industry or institutions. And so I'm not asking you to comment on the current neg-reg process, but in general, when we invite representatives of certain constituencies to the policymaking process, how do we make sure that what they are saying gets the same weight and is not dismissed in that space?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bradley. Thank you for asking it. Negotiated rulemaking is something that I am deeply involved with these days. And it's interesting being on this side of the negotiated rulemaking screen versus the side that you're on, because I see things happening, and I'm wearing sort of like my policymaker hat as well as my advocate hat. And so my main advice is to remember that the lawyers, the people in the department, at least for this department, right? They're not your enemies, they're your allies. And we're very open to all types of engagements. And so if you see things that are occurring that you have concerns about, certainly you can address them during the negotiated rulemaking session, but you can also call us at any time. It is important for me in this position to make sure that I always represent the communities that are often invisible or disenfranchised in the policymaking process. And you rattled off several of them. Certainly the ones that come top of mind to me right now are the disability community and the incarcerated students community. We very rarely see them. We know they're there. And I'm pleased that in this rulemaking session, they are visible and they are vocal. The thing we got to remember about representation is just because we're there doesn't mean it's going to be easy. There's always a constant push, pull, tug, trade-offs. That is the hope and dream of democracy, that we can come to some type of consensus and some type of agreement through the listening and attentiveness of our sort of experiences. So I am glad that these communities are engaged in the rulemaking process. I am glad that they are giving voice to their experiences. I want to assure you that those of us in the department, we are listening and paying close attention. It's not being dismissed. Your voices have equal weight. And it's also important that on this side of the fence that we've got people who understand those experiences, who are the lawyers, who are the negotiators, who are the ones who are making decisions. And I think it's pretty safe to say that you have allies over here. We're listening, we're paying attention.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm going to go to Jeananne next, but just before I do, I also want to encourage people. If anyone would also like to share a story or an experience they had that reflects the types of things that we're talking about today, representation, or lack of representation that you observed and an impact that that had on you or a group of individuals that you represent, I want to encourage that as well. Jeananne, I'm going to go to you next.
Thank you. I mean, I was also named after like a powerful woman back home, and my only story is just that I think that I remember the first time I saw my own identity reflected on TV in the United States that was not on the news was when I was 30 years old. And the first time I read a book written specifically about my identity was also probably my 30s. But yeah, my question though for Michelle, great to see you, was you know, talking more about the how, and in my role, I work a lot with research and data. Can you speak about what kind of data and research might be necessary to ensure representation, you know, like helps identify gaps or touch on limitations of the current federal, racial, and ethnic categories, or insights about the way the department's thinking about that?
Sure. At some point, I would love to hear the story about your name. And at some point, I would love to know who you saw and what you read that gave you, we can do that conversation at another time, but I think it's quite telling that we still have a long way to go in terms of our continued push for representation if you did not see those images until you were 30. Now you look like you're under 30, so kudos for being 31, but you know, I think it's really telling. And so that's why I'm glad you all are here. That's why I wanted to know who you were and kind of hear where you're working, because it really is incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we don't recreate that world for the next generation. You know, I've talked to several of you on the screen. I'm thinking like Caroline and Mary Ellen and Nathan and other Letty about my own kid. I've talked to you about your kids. We don't want our kids seeing themselves reflected in critical spaces until they're 30. They need to see that right now, because as my mom's story about my name, you know, I didn't know who Michelle Clark was, but I knew that because she had such a powerful influence on my mom, that then gave me something to rise to. And maybe that's why my mom told that story over and over again, but it gave me something to rise to. In terms of your question about research, I think many of you might know I'm a researcher at heart. And so I think research is really important. I don't think that we have all the questions and answers figured out. And I think I do think that there's a lot that we do know, but because trends change, times change, things evolve. The pandemic certainly has shown us that we have to constantly be willing to ask tough questions. So I think the important thing for researchers is to be willing to ask tough questions. It's almost like you should be an investigative journalist. Like that is what you're doing. You are sussing out the problems, and you are bringing that sort of critical lens to these issues to make sure that we are addressing them. It's really important to have disaggregated research. And very often when we disaggregate research, you know, we are now familiar with looking at Black and Brown communities, but I think we should go even deeper than that. I think there's a lot of diversity in the Asian American Pacific Islander community that often gets overlooked because we focus on numbers that lead us to believe that all the experiences of all Asian Americans are the same. And so I would invite all of you to really interrogate that and to think about that and to really, you know, think about research in a way that disaggregates. I also think that there is an importance for qualitative and quantitative research, even in policymaking. Certainly the numbers matter. We're always looking for the numbers. We want to analyze them and we want to look at the trends, but having real life people, well, I think it's important for us to remember that the numbers represent people, right? And then we want to be able to lift up real stories and even if we call them anecdotes, I think anecdotes have power. But we want to make sure that we are not biasing one type of research over the other in the policymaking process, because as I've seen, both are very important. And sometimes when you have the small size N, like in the situation of Native American communities or AAPI communities, it's hard to tell that story without qualitative data. So I would just invite researchers to keep doing what they're doing.
I'm so glad you're talking about that, Michelle, especially with regard to the research, because again, it frames how you talk about challenges and even the policy solutions that are on the table. So it's important to have that data. And I did want to share one anecdote. Years ago, I was in a meeting with a group of policymakers, and we were talking about remedial education. And people were talking about, why are students spending their entire first semester in remedial courses when they could just be taking courses over the summer or going through online. And one person brought in this, said, well, I know that there's a particular organization that partners with institutions. It's only $99. Why aren't people spending their summer with just spending $99 rather than spending 12 weeks over the course of their first semester and spending all those extra dollars for school? And someone had to actually raise their hand and said, we don't have $99.
We don't have $99.
Policymakers, it was not their lived experience. They could not understand that wasn't actually an option. So anecdotes are really quite powerful.
They're very important. And it's really, people can't make policies on things that they haven't studied or thought about. And that's the other really important part about research. Just like you give that story, Mary Ellen, I think one challenge that I constantly run into is around private colleges, for example. I think everybody thinks of private colleges and they think of Harvard. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, there is so much diversity in the private college sector. I can tell the story how I worked at a private college that was created for the sons and daughters of coal miners in rural Pennsylvania. And I think that we've got to make sure that people understand that there is this type of diversity out there, but we can't do it unless we got the data and unless we got the people who will give voice to it.
Yeah, absolutely. People remember the stories.
They do remember the stories.
Caitlin, I see your hand raised.
Kind of piggyback off what you just said with giving people that give voice to these stories. So you mentioned at the beginning that there are low levels of inclusion in Congress for women and people of color, and there's also massive distrust in the government right now, and it's been increasing for a really long time. So what recommendations do you have for those of us in this space to bring in more people that have historically been marginalized from policy discussions?
Just keep doing it. So I just think that all those things are true. Yeah, there's a need, there's some distrust, but there's also a lot of good work that is going on each and every day. There are many people, there's me, there's you all, who are constantly rolling up our sleeves to engage in this process that is complicated, messy, and fraught with systemic inequities. Like, that is constant. And, I think that we have to remember that we're fighting a long fight, not a short one. So at every iteration, we are making progress. You may not see the sky turn, colors, but we're making progress. And I think it's just important to stay engaged and continue to do the work, but also for those of you who can rise to the level of becoming one of those people who are in an influential space that can sort of give even more voice, get in more rooms, be more of a decision maker. It's really important for more of us to be in those positions and to be in those rooms. And I just want to say that, I support that, and I will be happy to support any of you. But I also recognize why people don't do it. Sometimes we don't do it because the process wasn't created for us. So we don't know the rules of engagement, and sometimes we don't even know how to engage. And I am a product of that. Like, I may be sitting here in the seat of the Department of Education, but it was because I had people who mentored me and told me, Michelle, go to the right, not to the left. Say this, not say that. And that's really important because I was not taught that as a child. Like, I did not grow up with that background. I did not know some of the things that I know now. And so when we do get in these positions, we've got to make sure that we are reaching back and sharing that knowledge with others so that we can, it's good to have somebody who's the first Black, female president, first Asian American president. Like, oh, that's good. But we want to have 100 of them. Like we just need more. We can't expect Kamala to do it all. So we got to have more of us. We got to have I just think that that's what's really at the heart of it all, Caitlin.
Michelle, is there anything else? I think you've said a lot of this already, but when I look out at the folks on my screen here, a lot of you are either policymakers or policy influencers, no matter where you are in your career. You may just be starting out, but you are policy influencers in one way or the other. What more can all of us do? We've talked about reaching back and pulling people up. What else could we possibly do to ensure representation in the ranks of policymakers, policy influencers, and how else might we reimagine representation, even beyond the people who are in the room?
Sure. So I think, I've said this already, you got to be the solution. So that's the first thing. Many of us have visible markers that make people assume that we are representing certain communities. You look at me, I'm a Black woman. So you might assume that I'm representing Black women, and you would be right. But there are other invisible markers that you don't see that I represent. I'm a single parent, single working mom. So that's why I got excited when I saw the other mom. I get that community. So I am a very strong advocate for women who are going to school while taking care of their children. I am the daughter of a man who was a Vietnam veteran who suffered from PTSD, what we now call PTSD, but when my father was going through it, there was such a stigma on it that no one really, really wanted to talk about it. So I am a huge champion for mental health issues, for veterans and military families. I am my parents had their first kid when they were teenagers. That wasn't me, that's my brother, but they had him when they were teenagers and then went to college as adults. I'm an advocate for teenage parents and for working adults. So those are the visible things that we don't see. So I think it's important that we know that we only know people at the point in which we engage in their story. So we should not make assumptions about who people are, what they stand for, and what they believe until we get to know them. So that ties into my second part. First would be the solution. Second is always be curious and be a good listener and be willing to engage authentically with people. Because there are other things that I may not represent either from an invisible or visible marker that I care deeply about, like tribal students at tribal colleges and universities. I care very deeply about those issues. I care very deeply about incarcerated students or defaulted student loan borrowers, but you wouldn't know me unless you got to know me and got to know sort of my background. So let's make sure that we don't make false assumptions about people. And I think in this city, I feel like people often do that. They make snap judgments about who people are and where they come from. And that goes across racial lines without getting to know them. The second I would say is be a mentor to others. You may feel like, oh, I'm just getting started, but somebody's looking at you and looking up to you. Somebody's thinking, oh my gosh, how did Sarah do it? How did Phil do it? I'm talking to you, I'm looking at your names on the screen. So they're looking at you wondering, how did you get where you are? And even though you might feel like you're still struggling to get where you want to be, you can help somebody take your position one day. One of my sort of beliefs is that as we always got to be thinking about, who's on the next bench. So you got the first string, who's on the second string? How are we developing that second and third string to make sure that they're ready to get in the game whenever their time arises? And the last thing I would say is that each of you will one day, if not already, be able to exercise hiring authority. And when you do that, you need to be thinking about representation. How important is that to you and the work that you're doing? And I want to give a shout out to PNPI because I know you all run an internship program. You've been doing it for a number of years, and you have always been very deliberate about making sure that that person who gets that internship is from a community that has been underserved or from institutions that have been under-resourced. And I think that's another very simple way of how we can do our part to build up that bench of leaders who can take on these really important roles. So don't think that your efforts are too small. They're pretty significant for the person who will benefit from them.
So Michelle, I can't believe it. Our time is up. This was wonderful. You know, a few things that stuck with me, you know, you cannot be what you cannot see, be part of the solution, don't make assumptions, be a mentor. I feel like we've got a rallying cry here. And I really want to thank you for taking this time with us today. And I really want to thank all of you for being present today and look forward to working with all of you